Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session on Money Talks, investing in food and farming for the future. Do feel free to come closer. We like to be friendly. This is a very big subject and a very daunting subject, but I think we're going to hear some very interesting and challenging ideas, initiatives, and also possibly some of the difficulties. My name is Susie Weldon. I'm Director of Communications for Faith Invest. And those of you who looked at the program a few days ago will be expecting my boss, Martin Palmer. He's unfortunately ill today, so I've stepped in to take his place. Faith Invest is a global non-profit that supports faith groups to invest in line with their values. And if I get a chance, I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. But in order to start, we would like to invite you to take part in a word cloud. You should see in a second details of how you can do this. We'd like you, in just 2 or 3 words, to give us your ideas. What are the key priorities for this area? It'd be quite interesting to know what people in the room think we should be focusing on. And while you're doing that, let me just set the scene a little bit for why we need this session. I was really struck by excellent presentations yesterday about so many conversations talking about building communities, building farmer networks, working with the grassroots. We're kind of talking about the big levers that lie behind all of that when we think of the global food system. Those kind of big invisible corporations and money managers that have such a massive influence on the global food system. So why is Faith Invest as an organization interested in this area? Well, it might surprise you to know that the Faiths are very significant investors in the global stock markets. And until fairly recently, most of them hadn't really looked at where their money was being invested, mostly because it's managed by the professional money managers, and the faith leaders hadn't really focused on that. We help faith groups to look at where their money is invested and whether it reflects their values, and if not, to develop policies and practices that will ensure it does. And we had a conference last October where this subject of the global food system came up, and it was a real shock to the faith-based investors in the room. This wasn't an issue that they were aware of really at all. They're fully on board with fossil fuel reduction, with energy transformation, etc., but they hadn't really realized the critical importance of the global food system and how little time we have to move to more sustainable practices. And I think that's probably true for almost everyone else outside this room. So this is a massive challenge and a very important one. So, agroecology, the biggest, and animal welfare and local food economies are the biggest. Just transition is up there as well, small-scale farmers, diversity, and a lot of plant-based alternatives. I don't know if anyone on the panel here, if there's anything there that has particularly struck you, that echoes with you, or is there anything missing that you think needs to be there? We are talking about financing the global food system after all. Reducing meat consumption, we heard a lot about that this morning. Anyone want to make a comment?
Inequality, gender.
Missing.
Yeah, as far as I can read.
And Peter or Rachel, you had something to say?
What I notice when I look at this presentation is actually the breadth of topics that are here. And when people say sustainable agriculture, I don't think everybody thinks of all of these topics. And this is in the financial sector when we say ESG, so environmental social governance. It's all of these different topics that they could be related to the environment, they could be climate, they could be all of these social issues. And it's really important to remember with sustainable agriculture and the way we move forward with it, not to forget any one of these and to consider these collectively, because I think often, particularly the S of ESG, can not be thought about as much. It's really important to consider all of these collectively when we consider ESG and sustainable agriculture.
And Peter, I think you wanted to say something.
Yes, a number of things I think possibly should be added. Climate change, biodiversity loss, food, not feed, and crucially the Sustainable Development Goals. Thanks.
So thank you very much for that. Very interesting first look at some of the issues that people in the room are very concerned about. So what we're going to be talking about today is how we can shift capital to fund the kind of food system we not only want, but we actually need for the benefit of people and planet. We know, and we've heard this morning, really interesting presentations about how much the global industrialized food system is driven and funded by finance. And we have to find a way of tackling that and changing that. So I'm going to invite as our first speaker, Peter Elwin, Head of Food and Land Use for Planet Tracker, which is a non-profit financial think tank that produces analytics and reports. And they've recently produced a roadmap for transforming the financial system. So Peter, thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed. So Planet Tracker is a non-profit think tank. We're focused on the financial markets and financial institutions seeking to change their behaviour and to use that as a lever for effecting change in the underlying systems that we look at. One of the systems we look at is food systems. That's my job. I'm head of our food systems program. And recently we've been funded to produce a report which looks at what financial institutions should be doing and can do in order to help drive the required transformation of the food system. We've heard a lot of fantastic talks over the last sort of day and a half explaining the risks in the system and why transformation is needed. But I think we've also heard that many financial institutions are quite ignorant about actually what they need to do and why they need to do it. We analysed 400,000 companies as part of our sort of process to get to the point of writing this report. Private finance supplies about $8.6 trillion to the food system. That's a bit of a guess, but that's a reasonably well-founded guess based on our analysis. And as I say, we produced this roadmap, this report, which lays out the actions that financial institutions should actually be taking. And as an aside, I hope you noticed from an anthropological perspective, I thought it was important to wear the traditional dress of the tribe that I interact with. So I've done that for your benefit. This is not really telling you anything new, but again, I think it's interesting to see what companies are disclosing. Companies are not disclosing very much, and many companies, out of our 400,000 companies we surveyed, most of those companies are not really disclosing anything. But of the companies that do disclose, there is an interesting, and I guess sort of encouraging coincidence between what the companies are saying and what sort of academic studies say of a sort of macro perspective of the food system. And that is that the harms are happening at the upstream end. Now, that's not to say that the producers of food want to cause those harms, but that's practically speaking where it's happening. It's on the farm, in the field, which is where the sort of pollution is occurring. What is then interesting, of course, is where is the money going? Where's the funding being provided? It's not going to them proportionately. It's actually going to the middle of the value chain. It's going to the manufacturers and distributors. So the big food manufacturing companies are getting the vast majority of the funding, both in terms of bank lending and also in terms of public equity finance. But you will notice bank lending a little bit more important for the food producers, sort of upstream end as we call it, than public equity financing. A lot of farms, you don't get shareholders investing in farms because they regard them as too risky and not profitable enough. The downstream end, retailers and food service companies sort of equally popular with banks and with equity investors. Moving on to something that Jennifer was talking about earlier in the first session, but this is just sort of the view of our database, distribution of revenues across the global food system based on our sample of 400,000, but we think it's pretty representative. Inputs, that's the chemical providers and the sort of providers of manufacturing companies. We've sort of deliberately focused just on the bits they do in relation to agriculture, so that one we expect to be a pretty small slice of the overall system.
Yes.
25% being captured by producers and traders, 46% being captured by the manufacturers and distributors, and then another 24% by the retailers and food service companies. That's the revenue. If you look at the profit, the value after all costs, a totally different picture emerges, and you've got nearly half the value being captured by the downstream end of the supply chain, the retailers and the food service companies. Another chunk being captured by the producers and traders, and a really tiny proportion being captured by the producers. So not necessarily surprising to many of you who understand the food system, but it's interesting to see some hard numbers. So what should the financial sector do about this? What do we think are the actions and the sort of focuses that they should be having to help transform the food system? Well, we've set out 4 transformation themes that they should be thinking about, which are responsible supply chains. So that covers labor rights, that covers sort of land rights at the producer end, that covers what's going on in the middle and all the way down to the other end. So we think that financial institutions should be talking particularly to the downstream players and the midstream players that they're funding and saying, you need to know what's going on further up the value chain at the producer end of the spectrum. They need to increase efficiency. We have to increase the efficiency of the food system. We've got to produce more food with less sort of inputs, less land, and less pollution. It's got to be efficiency on a true cost basis, though. If you talk to financial institutions about efficiency, they think of that 20-story pig farm that Henry Dimbleby was flagging earlier, and that's absolutely not what we are advocating, nor indeed, as we've already heard over the course of yesterday and today, it's not what the system needs. So true cost efficiency, reducing pollution, that's a complete no-brainer. And then sustainable product offerings, just briefly on that. A lot of chat about the consumer. I don't know about you, but I'm a consumer. I find making choices in supermarkets and sort of food retail outfits absolutely impossible because they persuade me. Have another chocolate bar. And my inner Neanderthal goes, yes, I'll have a chocolate bar. When really I should be having a vegan burger or a slice of lettuce. So getting the companies to focus on how they persuade us is really important. And then we set out 6 actions. A lot of financial institutions say to us, look, this is very complicated. It's all very hard. What do we do? Give us a simple answer. So we felt duty-bound to give some simple answers. And if they take 1 or ideally all 6 of those, they will have a massive impact on both the climate footprint of the food system, but also, very importantly, its nature footprint. And as we've heard, almost as a corollary, if you like, sort of collateral benefit, animal welfare will improve as a result. Worth just flagging there, make agricultural systems regenerative. I have some interesting conversations over the last day or so. Regenerative agriculture, huge possibility for greenwashing, so we need to be cautious around that, but we think that concept of a system that grows its base rather than shrinking it is important. I'm about to be gonged off, so I'll stop.
Thank you. I'm sorry, one of the facts of this conference is you could listen to every single speaker for at least 2 hours, but we're very tight on time. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Jennifer Clapp. She is with the university, and I'm flicking through my notes, she's professor in the School of Environment, Resources and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo. And she will also be talking about the macro picture and painting a picture of where we are. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks, Susie. Thanks very much, and nice to go after Peter, showing us the ways in which finance can shift into better activities. And I agree that finance does need to shift towards supporting more sustainable food systems, especially given that there are trillions of dollars, I'm going to use the word sloshing around the global economy, just to give that image in your head. There is money out there, big investors, and they're constantly looking for profits, and they're looking for places to go. And so if we can encourage them to invest in better activities, that's great. But I'm going to make 3 points in the 4 minutes and 17 seconds I have left. And the first point is that while that does need to happen, I do not think we should be relying on that approach alone to be addressing the problems in the food system. So yes, we need to shift those investments. But what I see happening, and not to downplay the significance of some of these developments, we have to remember that investors are constantly seeking returns, and they're seeking returns through companies that are profitable. And companies, to get profits, they're doing things that are obviously going to be marketable in global markets. But what we're seeing is, in a sense, many of these companies painting themselves as green in order to attract those financial dollars. And so, for example, the rise of digital agriculture is being portrayed by the companies themselves as being low carbon, low chemical. This is great. Gene editing is going to make all plants drought resistant and flood resistant, et cetera. But actually, if you look at the activities that they're doing with these kinds of technologies, they're basically making really fancy satellite connected tractors and et cetera that still are spraying chemicals. And so they're still in that chemical industrial agricultural paradigm, but suddenly they look green, and then they're attracting these financial investments. And I had already mentioned in the previous session, there's also this rise of plant-based processed foods. But we can't forget, there's still processed foods. Many are ultra-processed, and they're not that good for you. And so we're not seeing these trillions of dollars sloshing around the global economy going towards supporting efforts for local and small-scale agriculture, or even for people to cook plants and eat them at home. And so I don't want to be like a big Debbie Downer about shifting finance, but I do think that we can't rely on that alone. So what do we need instead? I mean, what we need are massive shifts in the way that states they're often subsidizing those systems that are run by the large corporations that are greenwashing and et cetera, but they need to be supporting the small-scale producers instead of the big companies. And we also need, better systems of credit. This was mentioned in the previous session as well. A credit for small-scale producers. We can't forget that in the last transition toward industrial agriculture, there was credit being provided. It was being provided by the tractor companies. This is how farmers were financing their transition. They were paying 10% interest rates to these big machinery companies. What we need is the state to step in and provide that kind of better credit terms for small-scale producers. And I also would say that the conversation about shifting finance in this sort of global financial investment world is largely a global north conversation. And we can't forget there are other big financial issues, especially facing the global south, that we need to be aware of and pay attention to. So IPES Food, for example, recently published a new report, Breaking the Cycle of Unsustainable Food Systems, Hunger and Debt, which points out that we are on the brink of another major developing country debt crisis. We've got over 20 countries right now in both debt distress and food insecurity at the same time. And we have to remember that in the 1980s, when we had the last big developing country debt crisis, the way that crisis was dealt with baked in unsustainable food systems. It baked it in by basically encouraging countries by giving them debt relief. In return, they had to focus on export crops. They had to open their markets and import cheap subsidized grain from the global north. It made them food import dependent, and it also extracted wealth from those countries via export crops. So we have to make sure the way we deal with this current crisis does not reinforce that cycle. So we need debt relief, but it needs to go hand in hand with financing for sustainable agriculture, and we need to repair basically the historical injustices that occurred in the global south through that last crisis. And I see I'm completely out of time, so I'll leave my third point I'll just leave it and maybe come back to it later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, you guys can always ask her in the Q&A what her third point was. But I think that was a very salutary and necessary reminder after Peter's mention of $8.6 trillion of private finance going into the global food system. A reminder that investors are in it because they want to make money and not necessarily because they are passionate about good food. But we have to find a way of shifting that finance into the initiatives that we need as a planet and as people. I'm going to invite another professor to come up next, Beena Agarwal, Professor of Development Economics and Environment at the Global Development Institute in Manchester University. And I think she's also going to be telling us that we can't just focus on the kind of global finance system. There are other voices, not only money, that needs to talk. Bina.
Hi, these systems are not designed for short people like me. So I'm actually going to provide you a counterpoint to, but also some complementary aspects to the first two speakers, because I will be focusing on smallholders in developing economies, and I'll outline both the challenges they face and possible solutions. And we need solutions not only to deliver finance to small farmers, but also to make them economically and environmentally more viable. I think we all agree on that. Now, what are the challenges? Globally, some 84% of farmers across 111 countries are small and marginal, by which it means they cultivate less than 2 hectares. Peter asked me he couldn't find data on how many smallholders there are. There are 570 million smallholders cultivating less than 2 hectares. Most of these are located in developing countries, but many, surprisingly, are also in Europe. Did you know that 43% of farmers in the European Union cultivate less than 2 hectares? So to understand the issue of agricultural finance, I believe we need to focus especially on smallholders. So what do smallholders need finance for? For input purchase, for hiring seasonal labor, for irrigation and soil improvement, for marketing, and in many cases, even for leasing in land. However, not many have access to formal credit from banks. Most depend on informal sources such as moneylenders. Such finances need collateral, often in the form of land, sometimes of gold, and it comes at very high interest rates. Also, we know that given the precarities of rain-fed agriculture and climate change, the risk of crop loss is high, and farmers can easily default on repayments. So if their credit is from money lenders, they can even lose their land. But access to formal credit is also very unequal. For instance, with large farmers dominate, and in India, only 40% of smallholders are covered by formal finance. The rest depend on these informal sources like money lenders. And as you can imagine, women farmers are even more disadvantaged. So as a result, and especially in South Asia, but not only in South Asia, indebtedness tends to be high and is a major cause of farmer suicide. So for instance, in India, in one state alone, last year, there were over 1,800 farmer suicides over 8 months. And something like 10 to 15% in general tend to be women. But many farmers lack the institutional finance. Lack of institutional finance is only one side of the coin, so to speak. The other side is small farm size. Now, what does this create? This creates diseconomies of scale. It gives them low bargaining power in markets. It makes it difficult for smallholders to make profitable use of the finance that they get. Also, many don't want to risk moving to natural or agroecological practices because they feel that it's risky, they might get low yields. So is there a solution? I believe there are some directions to a solution. None of us can claim perfect solutions. So for instance, in South Asia's experience of microfinance has taught us one big thing, which is the benefits of group-oriented solutions compared to individual-oriented solutions. You're all familiar with the Grameen Bank, right? But and that's moved to many countries, including Arkansas, the idea of microcredit. But groups are important not only because they make access to finance possible, but they also enable its repayment. In fact, in India, the government took a further step. Sometimes government do correct things. In 2005, it launched the Joint Liability Scheme. And under this scheme, if a group of 4 to 10 individuals do savings and rotational credit among themselves for 6 months, they can then start a group enterprise and apply for a subsidized loan to the National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development. The loan is given on mutual guarantee and without collateral. Now, this scheme was set up to specially finance smallholders and tenant farmers. In some parts of India, smallholders have made very good use of this scheme and since launching a group enterprise is a precondition, it has encouraged farmers' collectives. So, for example, in the state of Kerala in South India, today we have 68,000 all-women group farms comprised of poor women. Most of them don't own land, but they pool their resources, lease in land, using the subsidized credit from the JLG scheme. And they pool their labor and costs and benefits, and they get a startup grant from the government. What are they doing? They're doing organic agroecological farming. So I calculated the relative profits and profitability of a sample of group farms, women's group farms, compared them with individual family farms, which are largely male-managed. And what did I find? That the group farms had 1.8 times the annual value of output and 5 times the net returns per farm relative to individual family farms. So the groups gain from all the sorts of things we can imagine: economies of scale, risk sharing, skill sharing, labor cost sharing, and greater bargaining power in markets. And these groups also survived COVID and were much more food secure than individual farmers who'd lost because of labor shortages and inability to sell. You might say, well, Kerala is special. Some people say that. But in fact, you find that you can find group farms developing in other parts of India, Eastern India, Western India. France also has group farms, although not from smallholders. So in a word, I would say that a group approach to delivering finance to smallholders and encouraging them to farm jointly without losing their property rights could prove to be the catalyst we need to promote economically viable and environmentally sustainable and, if you like, compassionate agriculture and food systems. So let's not just look at technical solutions, let's also look at institutional solutions and institutional innovations.
Thank you. Thank you, Bina. Another very important aspect of finance, which is, who at the grassroots gets it. And we certainly saw that from Peter's extraordinary slide about the amount of money that is actually absorbed in the global food system by the intermediaries. So the next person I'm going to invite to come up and speak is Glenn Horowitz. He is the founder and CEO of Mighty Earth, which is a global advocacy organization working to defend the planet. In the last session, we heard a call for innovative, disruptive thinking. And Glenn has certainly applied a fair bit of that to other areas. He's worked to help bring about a massive reduction in deforestation for palm oil, for example. And he's going to share some of his insights and experiences as far as we can apply those to the finance system. Glenn, thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. I got involved in this work because of existential worry about what was happening to nature, to the climate. You can see before you this severe imbalance that our Earth is in, with 96% of mammal biomass taken up by humans, their livestock, and pets. This is not right. And if you go to the next slide, industrial agriculture is causing more climate pollution than all the cars, trucks, ships, and planes in the world combined. It's been said cows are the new coal, and I think that is very true. And on the flip side, I think this can be very daunting, because you look at the companies that are involved in driving this destruction, it seems intractable. You look at the food systems, you look at the iron grip many of these companies have over governments all over the world. When we work on the Farm Bill in the United States, it is probably harder to drive change there politically than any other issue, because of the power of industrial agriculture in the corridors of power. And this is, I think, the fundamental challenge. And yet, this entire crisis that we've been hearing about is avoidable. And we've had experience transforming industries, food systems that seemed very intractable. So I want to talk to you both about the success and if you can go to the next slide, and also how we're going to make this change. So about 10 years ago, we first set out to tackle deforestation in Southeast Asia. This seemed like an impossible problem. There were 1 million acres being destroyed every year for palm oil. You could fly from Kuala Lumpur to Singapore at 30,000 feet in a jet and look out your window and not see any other organism except monoculture palm oil. And this was forests that were once teeming with orangutans, Sumatran tigers, tree kangaroos, and other amazing creatures. The conventional wisdom was that you couldn't really do anything about it. The governments were corrupt and in the pockets of these very industries. And even from a financial perspective, the demand for palm oil in particular was coming from developing Asian countries where there simply wasn't a great attention to sustainability and there was great price sensitivity. But we needed to change this. And there wasn't the large-scale finance coming from climate legislation that could make trees worth more alive than dead. And what we've found, if you can go to the next slide, is that that you could actually change these companies. And paradoxically, the very companies most responsible for our environmental crisis were also the ones best positioned to solve it. But we needed to pressure them. It was going to be challenging because ultimately we were looking at the big agribusinesses that were most responsible for the problem. We developed a strategy to influence them. We focused on Asia's largest agribusinesses. And we found financial levers that could push them. So when they had joint venture partners in the US and Europe, and our grassroots organizers went out to their headquarters and both protested outside and went to their recruiters and said, we don't want to work with you if you're going to be in bed with the companies destroying the rainforests of Southeast Asia. We worked with investors like Green Century Capital Management, who went directly to the companies and said, why are you risking your multi-billion-dollar brand in partnerships with the companies bulldozing the rainforest? And the amazing thing was this kind of pressure and the media that we got, it really worked. Pretty soon we were sitting at the table with the tycoons running this industry, causing all the damage, and were able to get them to commit to ban deforestation, ban destruction of peatlands, and ban stealing land from indigenous people. We set up monitoring systems. So every month we monitor 21 million hectares of forests across Southeast Asia and file alerts with the 32 largest companies. The results of this were, after several years and a lot of hard work and backward steps, is that, and deploying these models across industry, we've seen a 95% decline in deforestation for palm oil. We've deployed this model in the rubber industry. Our allies have done this in pulp and paper. And across the board, you've seen a 90% decline in deforestation from some of the most opaque and corrupt companies in the world. If you go to the next slide. So this is great. This is it's a gigaton scale climate success. There's thousands of orangutans that are alive today because of it. But the biggest source of deforestation, of climate pollution, by far in agriculture, is the meat industry. And that's who we're tackling now. And this is the kind of map that we did when we were working on Southeast Asian commodities. We need to deploy those same kinds of pressure. It has been harder. Those industries are $60 billion a year industries. The meat industry is a $1 trillion a year industry and is responsible for more destruction. However, what we have found that as we've been able to reach a little bit of scale over the past year and a half is we finally got commercial action from some of the big actors. You may have seen over the last couple of weeks, we did a big expose about how Tesco was sourcing from Cargill, one of the 3 leading drivers of deforestation. We caught Cargill red-handed sourcing from a supplier engaged in illegal deforestation in the Amazon. And then we've had a busy couple of weeks. We did a big report on Barclays, the largest financier of JBS, itself the largest driver of deforestation and far and away the largest driver of climate pollution in all of agriculture with a greater climate footprint than Spain. And we've gotten Barclays to announce a new policy to ban deforestation, setting a precedent in the banking sector. These are all signs of progress, but we need to bring this to scale. We need to get others, first of all, companies like Tesco to drop irresponsible suppliers, so put the same kind of pressure they did in palm oil and other commodities with great success. We need more banks to adopt these policies and finally implement them. We know that the big solutions are possible. We need to focus our advocacy and attention in strategic ways so we can quickly drive the kind of transformation to end deforestation, shift to regenerative agriculture, and ultimately shift to alternative proteins that can dramatically reduce the impact we have on Earth, allow large-scale rewilding that can suck gigatons of carbon out of the air. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Glenn. That was really inspiring, actually, because I think we can all get quite gloomy about the challenge, but that was a really inspiring offer of possibility if we can come together on this. The next person I'm going to invite to speak is Peter. Peter Stevenson is Chief Policy Advisor with Compassion in World Farming, and you may have heard him, as you would have heard Jennifer this morning. And he's going to talk a bit about some of the real economics in the food system.
Thank you. I want to think about some of the economic thinking that underlies the current food system. You know, factory-farmed meat and milk are cheap at the supermarket checkout, but that's only been achieved by an economic sleight of hand. We've developed this distorting system which takes into account some costs, like housing and feeding the animals, totally ignores other costs, like the very real costs that arise from the harm being done to the environment, wildlife, and human health. And this has been recognized by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, who have said, and I quote, "In many countries, there's a worrying disconnect between the retail price of food and the true cost of its production. And as a consequence, this is the FAO speaking, food produced at great environmental cost in the form of greenhouse gas emissions, water and air pollution, habitat destruction, can appear to be cheaper than more sustainably produced food." Yesterday, Olivier de Schutter, who spoke yesterday, has said that any society in which healthy food is more expensive than unhealthy food is a society that must mend its price system. I love that phrase. And surely the same applies to any society in which food that respects natural resources and animal well-being is more expensive than environmentally damaging food with low animal welfare standards. So how do we mend our price system? And I'm going to have to talk about taxes, which terrifies politicians. These are not meant to be sin taxes, not some sort of punishment. They've got two purposes. Firstly, to actually internalize these real economic externalities, but also to help try and create the kind of healthy, humane food system that we want. So, for consumers, we're going to have to put taxes on inhumane, unhealthy, damaging food. And we're going to use every penny of that to lower the cost of healthy, humane food. There's going to be no increase in the price of food, just a rebalancing between different items. If we then look at farmers, we need to repurpose the subsidies. Again, we don't have to increase subsidies, just repurpose them, but they're going to farmers who are doing the really good things. We can do even more than that. We can give them some tax breaks so that they have generous capital allowances when they calculate net profits for tax purposes. We can actually even give them an extra tranche of tax-free income. And again, this won't cost the government anything because we're going to put taxes on the damaging inputs of factory farming, in particular agrochemicals. So that is how we mend our price system. We need to do one other thing. We need to get away from thinking in terms of gross domestic product, gross national product. It's a terribly crude way of measuring progress. We need to move to a more nuanced system like donut economics. I'm not sure if you've all seen the model of that, but it's got an outer ring. And on that has all the kind of planetary boundaries like greenhouse gas emissions, which we must not exceed. And it has an inner ring of societal objectives, social justice, good health, nutritious food, of the objectives that we need to reach. And this is a really good model for assessing whether proposed economic activities are going to harm the planet. Are they going to contribute to or detract from societal objectives? It's a good model for steering us through a very complex world. I've only got one problem with the donut. It's got, within its 21 planetary objectives and societal, planetary boundaries and societal objectives, it has no room for animal welfare. Let's have a 20-second aspect to the donut, good animal well-being. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow. Peter gets the prize. He's very experienced at delivering these talks. That was within 1 second of his time. Excellent. So finally, last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Rachel Harris to speak. She's Director for Environmental and Social Risk Management for Standard Chartered, which last year brought out an agribusiness position statement and does a lot of work, obviously, as you'll hear, on ESG.
Thank you. And I'm really honoured to be here today, and thank you so much for the invite and the opportunity to speak. Just for anyone that doesn't know, so Standard Chartered are an international financial institution. We are present and operate in around 59 markets globally, with a particular focus on emerging markets, so Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. I work in environmental and social risk management, so within the Chief Sustainability Office within Standard Chartered. And really sustainability is at the heart of a lot of the things that we do and the way that we operate. And I really do think that this is key for the big financial institutions, and it's a real change that has happened over the past few years. Transformation to global food systems is really going to take a huge amount of innovation and capital to support the investment that is required. And it's something, there's not going to be a silver bullet to it, but effectively it's going to rely on and come from a collaboration of public funds, private funds, government policymakers to really get behind this. I'd like to speak a little bit more about Standard Chartered and what we do in environmental and social risk. So we set out, when I say environmental and social risk, I think of this as managing potential negative impacts to environment and society, and also promoting good and best practice. And in doing this, it also makes good business sense and good financial sense. We have a set of standards that we apply to our corporate institutional banking clients, and these are called our position statements. So the position statements set out our criteria in environmental and socially sensitive sectors. So in metals and mining, in power generation, in chemicals, in infrastructure, but particularly also in agriculture. And it's actually through some of the work that we've been doing and engagement that we've had with Peter from the Farms Initiative in particular that I was invited here to speak on this. And in agriculture, so Peter mentioned earlier, we say no to cages and crates for livestock, but we also have restrictions and requirement across other types of agriculture, including forestry, fisheries, animal welfare, and also on particular crops such as soy and palm oil. We manage these and we work very much with our clients every day to apply these, and they draw from international best practice, so from the IFC performance standards and from the Equator Principles as well. It's really, really key to ensure that these minimum standards are applied and actually that it's consistent across the sector. You saw earlier on some slides that there were a few institutes that were flagged up there, but actually rolling this and making this mainstream, particularly in emerging markets, because that is where we have a huge group in population and on sustainability. There's been a huge move recently in the financial sector on climate risk in particular, and a big focus on climate. And I actually think that for biodiversity and for agriculture, we can draw a lot of learnings and parallels. It helped that in the UK in 2019, it became mandatory, so it was regulated that banks needed to manage their financial and their non-financial risks from climate change, being from physical risk, from extreme weather events, but also from transition risk as well. And what this also brought about is an additional level of transparency. So through the TCFD, we put out annual reports and do a lot of work behind that on how it is that climate risk management is embedded into government governance, into strategy. We also disclose on a lot of the techniques, because this is all very new in the last few years, so the techniques and the approaches for managing these risks. And in the industry, you know, the good thing is that there's a lot of work and innovation ongoing between institutions. So you have the TNFD, which is looking at the Task Force for Nature-Based Financial Disclosures, and I hope that this will also help to drive that in that particular way. But learning from that, there are three things. Collaboration is always key. We've heard it before, and we'll hear it again. Financial institutions are very competitive, so actually we like it when NGOs have their rankings and their indices, because it helps us see who's a front, who can we learn from, how can we do better. Collaboration between institutions as well, and making the business case, so it makes financial sense to manage environmental and social risks, particularly in the agricultural sector, and also to learn from what we've learned from climate, but don't let climate overshadow, because ultimately a third of emissions come from agriculture. So we really need to focus on agriculture to be able to meet our climate goals and make much more progress there.
Thank you. It's really great to hear of some of the really positive work that's been done by some banks. We're going to open the floor to questions now. Very quickly, before we do that, I just wanted to talk to you about an initiative that my organisation is involved in, because I think what we've heard today, I think one of the challenges with this subject, and you're talking about $8.6 trillion worth of private finance in this huge, complex global system with multiple actors, is it's really hard. There are so many different ways you can tackle it. And we've heard some great ideas around, well, certainly Glenn's kind of putting pressure on companies' reputation and bringing transparency to what they're doing, you know, providing finance, much needed finance to smallholder farmers, using tax as a lever to make sure the money is directed where we want to go, and stuff like that. But what we haven't heard, I suppose, is some sense of what kind of other funding mechanisms could be brought to bear. And there's an initiative that's being launched at COP28 in December called the Good Food Finance Network, which we're a member of. And that is in the process now of designing a co-investment platform. And the idea is that this will be able to bring transformational funding into the arena to direct money into the kind of climate-aligned, sort of nature-positive, socially inclusive food systems that we want. And the idea is that it will scale up investment, because that's what we really need. We've got $8.6 trillion of private finance, mostly going into systems we don't want. We need to scale up investment massively and quickly, because we don't have time. And the idea is it will also serve not just as a finance mechanism, but also as a kind of coordinating mechanism, so that it supports the mainstreaming of good food finance, but also coordinates it and monitors it so that it is going into the direction that we want. So look out for that. That's going to be announced at COP28, and it's Eat Forum, which is the Norwegian NGO that is one of the big movers behind this. But there are a bunch of different actors, lots of bilaterals involved in that. So thank you to all the speakers, but we're now going to move to questions, and perhaps inevitably, do feel free to put your hands up, and also do feel free to submit your questions online. I'm going to start with the first one here, which is, what's your third point, Jennifer?
Right. Well, it was a short point, but thank you for asking. I was just going to say the title of this session is Money Talks, and I know that finance is a really important lever that can be used to bring change in food systems. But interestingly, surveys of large corporations shows that regulation is an even more powerful lever. So I just wanted to remind us not to forget that regulation is important. And I was really interested in Peter's point.
Or Peter.
Or your point.
I'm
Glenn.
Glenn. That's Peter.
Glenn's point. I think it was Glenn's point about how voluntary measures can create demand for regulation. I found that really interesting. But I was interested to know, do we have to wait for voluntary measures to create conditions for better regulation, or can we just jump right to it? Or if we jump right to it, are we going to get things wrong, and will it be more effective if we go through the route of the theory of change? So I don't know, Susie, am I allowed to ask him a question?
Feel free.
Yeah, sure, thank you. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think just to say, Plan A for us has always been and remains government action. When it comes to protecting rainforests or requiring improved practices for agriculture, it is government's responsibility. I started this work on supply chains only when the United States failed to pass comprehensive climate legislation that had included $12 to $14 billion in annual funding for rainforests and a lot of incentives for agricultural sustainability. We are excited about the $20 billion in incentives for sustainable agriculture in the Inflation Reduction Act that was just passed, and working on deploying that in an effective way, and especially about the passage of the EU deforestation regulation that bans imports of commodities linked to deforestation, that will finally give legal weight to some of the voluntary requirements that have been in place. There's more to do to expand it to the finance sector and other things. I think it's a self-reinforcing circle. So if you look at the deforestation regulation, we are seeing already that companies are trying to get out ahead of it through voluntary action. And then in the debates over it, we also saw entire industries that are going to be regulated by it, like the chocolate industry, like the rubber industry, that you would think would be fighting it tooth and nail. But the reality was, because they had made voluntary commitments already to stop deforestation, they perhaps felt some shame or perhaps felt fear that we would come after them, and were actually willing to support or at least not oppose these kinds of legislation. And so I think we have relied on this theory of change because of some of the political paralysis that has set in many jurisdictions. But we also need organizing and advocacy focused directly on policymakers. We do that as well, and it's an incredibly important piece of the puzzle.
Thank you. Bina, I think you...
I'll defer. Let's
Okay.
hear from the audience here.
Has anyone got any questions? There's loads on the system. This lady over here. Man, sorry, I can't see with the lights.
Peter's presentation on how tax and subsidies could even out and get good food out to all of us. How, for both Peter and the other panel members, how are governments engaging with that idea?
Should you want to take several questions at a time? Or?
Well, who would like to answer that one first? Peter,
My
would you like to-
hearing's rotten. Can somebody just repeat the question for me?
Sorry, would you repeat the question, please?
I was really impressed with your presentation on taxing and changing subsidies. But are governments, whether it's in the UK or Europe or US or wherever, are they engaging with that?
Are governments engaging with the idea of using the tax system?
No, they're running a mile from it. They're terrified about it. And, this is why I said, look, these are not sin taxes, that they're not some sort of punishment. They're trying to mend our price system. They're trying to help steer the food system into a healthy, humane, sustainable direction. But no, we've got an awful long way to go. But I feel that if we don't tackle the economics and all the related financial institutions and everything, that it's going to be very hard to make progress. And many economists have over the last 20 years talked about these externalities of the food system. You know, very specific costs arising from damaging food in terms of health, etc. And it's economists who said we need to internalize these externalities. So what I'm talking about is not really all that radical. And just one final point. A report by the International Monetary Fund, no less, has talked about the idea of fee-bates. In other words, rebates and fees. So farmers doing bad things would be charged a fee, factory farmers, and that money would be used to support the farmers doing good things. So again, from a government point of view, it's economically neutral. It doesn't cost them a penny. But it will steer farmers from the bad things to the good things. So we've a long way to go, but I think we need to talk about it. Thanks.
Okay, and Bina, you wanted to make a point?
Yeah, I do want to say something on taxes, the complexity of it. So for instance, in India, farmers are not taxed at all. Sure. Agricultural income is not taxed on the assumption that that's the only source of income, which also means that people who are doing large commercial farming are not taxed. But using taxes for good purposes, so for instance, you can draw on groundwater with zero penalty. In fact, you get free electricity. Now, that's been a huge driver in the overdrawing of groundwater by richer farmers. And it's led to such a depletion of groundwater in areas which are food baskets of India that it's touched arsenic levels. So only one state in India has any meters on groundwater. So you need taxes there. Fertilizers, now we get fertilizer subsidies. We keep talking about let's move away from chemical fertilizer. So it's politically difficult. I mean, this is the point. Taxes are driven by politics. Where do you put taxes and who is your constituency? And I think we need to factor that in, because economists can keep, myself, yourself, and many others, can keep making arguments which sound perfectly rational in economic terms, and they make no sense at all to the politicians and the policymakers because of the politics of it. However, I do support the idea that we need to tax bad practices, especially relating to water, fertilizers, and so on, and tax them where we don't tax them.
Thank you. Thank you. So the gentleman in front here, the first of them.
Thank you. I'm Emil Friesen, a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems. And one of the points that was mentioned is the very little investment in transformative research and development proposals between 0.5% and a few percent. And actually having a tool to measure how much investment is being made that is transformative, that is supporting agroecological transformation, is something that has been undertaken to develop a tool to measure which percentage, in how far projects, initiatives are actually contributing to transformation. And that is done in the context of the Agroecology Coalition that is now bringing together 44 countries, 108 organizations. And I think this is an opportunity to also join forces, and I would invite possible organizations that are present here to consider joining that coalition and help us to move in the right direction also from that perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very important point. Before I go on to anyone else, does anyone else want to respond to that here? Nope. Any other questions? Yes, another gentleman at the back there.
Thank you very much. My name is Jim Thomas. I'm working on the question of how can we defund industrial agriculture. That we talk about the many different harms that agribusiness has brought to the food system over the last century. And we've heard a little on climate and animal welfare issues, but really there's multiple harms. What we're also seeing is large agribusiness organizing itself through coalitions such as the FOLU Coalition or the World Economic Forum Food Systems Initiative, trying to determine what are the 6 priority areas, for example, for financing, but perhaps doing it in a way that works for agribusiness and extends their own interests, as Jennifer was saying, around digital agriculture or proteins and so forth. So I think there is a growing interest to follow what the fossil fuel activists have been saying around let's divest and defund not just from fossil fuels, let's divest and defund from agribusiness for its multiple harms. And I'm curious to know if folks on the panel would support that call for defunding agribusiness.
Thank you. A very interesting challenge. Who would like
Can I jump in on that one? I think we need to differentiate between divest, as in sell your shareholding, and defund, as in starve a company of debt funding and sort of working capital. I think divesting, my personal view, is not productive. If you sell your shares, somebody else will buy them. And generally, they'll be bought by somebody who doesn't share your values and is going to enjoy running the company privately, out of the view of the markets, with no disclosures, to carry on practicing whatever it wants. So I think divesting is a mistake, my personal view. Defunding, I think it has much more to say for it, and it was interesting hearing from Rachel about Standard Chartered's sort of approach to encourage sustainable business, and it's great if we can see banks actually sort of penalising, charging higher prices for unsustainable business. That's, if you like, soft defunding. We get to the point where Barclays is actually saying we will not fund this sort of activity. That's effectively defunding. That actually works because companies need cash every day, every week, and they get it from their banks. They do not get it from shareholders. So defunding, yes. Disinvestment, a mistake.
Jennifer?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I appreciate your comments. And just to say that the recent agribusiness mergers in the agricultural input sector, when Bayer bought Monsanto and Corteva was created out of Dow and DuPont, and ChemChina bought Syngenta, those were highly, I mean, maybe not Corteva as much, but the other two deals were highly leveraged. They had to borrow billions and billions of dollars to make that happen. And if the banks and funders had said no, we would have a more diverse set of companies in there. So I see great merit in your suggestion. Thanks.
Anyone else? Yes, Glenn?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think the fundamental principle is a sound one. I may have just a slight different perspective. I mean, I think defunding in all ways of destructive agribusiness companies is positive. I do, I guess fear that it's challenging to change the system fundamentally, so fundamentally that we're, driving a shift to small-scale agroecological production. It would be great. I mean, agroforestry alone can, essentially suck all the carbon that we need out of the atmosphere. But I would say that whether it's divesting or defunding, it is extremely helpful. It is the probably most powerful thing the finance sector can do to send an actual signal to the companies causing the destruction. And I have a slightly different view of divestment in the sense that what we have seen across agribusiness is that until some investors actually divest, the companies do not take the polite pulling on the sleeves of so-called responsible investors seriously. It is only when significant investors or a lot of small-scale investors start to pull their money out that the companies start to look around and fear that others are coming behind them. I think one of the reasons that we were able to make progress in Southeast Asian commodities was you had the Norwegian Pension Fund, the world's largest, and several others actually pull their funds out, and it made them take everybody else more seriously. We have seen when that has happened that the companies will discuss it at their shareholder meeting, at their board meetings. We have a lot of friends in these agribusiness companies who leak us information constantly, and when that happens, it's very powerful. I do agree, though. I mean, I think the banking sector does absolutely need to do more. They have lagged behind institutional investors overall and supply chain companies on taking action. And so, this is an emerging sector where because if they actually do defund, it would make a difference and create a very powerful incentive. So I hope Barclays, for instance, backs up what they've just said. It would be, it could really be transformative. I'm sure and other banks follow as well.
Thank you. Peter, I think you wanted to say something.
Yes, I want. we're part of a coalition called Stop Financing Factory Farming, but that is very much directed at the multilateral development banks, these big public banks that I spoke about earlier this morning. And, you know, these banks are pouring millions into factory farming, and they're governed by governments. They have executive directors who are appointed by the government. I find it an utter disgrace that the UK government is not putting any pressure on the International Finance Corporation to not fund multi-storey pig farms in China. That said, you know, it's up to us as civil society organisations to do much more work in this area, to really alert governments, particularly those that are potentially sympathetic, to say, look, don't let these big public banks finance factory farming. Steer them in the direction of financing the kind of small-scale farming that can really make sense to small farmer livelihoods in the global south. So let's think about these big public banks as well as the commercial banks. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to go to one of the questions because we've got quite a few that have come in online, and then I'm going to go to the lady that's over there. So question here, there are not one but two food systems. 70% of the world are fed outside of industrialized agri-food chains in peasant and territorial food webs. How does this reality of two food systems change how we think about finance activism on food systems? So who would like to tackle that one first?
Yeah, I think we seem to be talking, it's good to be explicit that we're talking about two regions, in fact. You're talking about the global north, which is justly and correctly concerned about industrial agriculture, and many developing countries who are not, their food systems don't come from industrial. I don't go to the supermarket. Often the vegetable vendor might come to every morning to your house. This is in Delhi, I mean, very urbanized metropolitan city. So it would be helpful to see what the problems are with industrial agriculture, what would work in terms of pushing that back, and then separately talk about food systems where there's a different financial question involved. That's what I was trying to raise, that for smallholders, you need finance. I don't think we need international banks to fund the global south. Our governments are perfectly able to do that. What you need is shift in government policy with civil society within the country. I'm sure if you approach the Indian government, they would say, thank you very much. We're quite able to fund our smallholders. So I'm merely saying that I think the way we have the narrative, perhaps instead of being inclusive and saying everything applies to everybody else, let's see if there's cross-learning involved. And here I would make a small pitch. Let's return to the face of the farmer. The face of the farmer, which is small, which is isolated, women farmers, and these are smallholders or medium farmers, not just in developing countries, but also in Europe. I mean, I was working in France, and you have, Emile will have another figure or may collaborate, but 35% of the farmers are not able to marry because they're isolated. So I'm merely saying that the idea of individual approaches, group approaches do matter everywhere. And this cross-learning, let's look at this Indian experiment of the National Bank for Agricultural and Rural Development, which is able across the country to give you loans if you form groups and do group enterprises without collateral. So is there something we can say also to other regions from that? And similarly, the pushback on industrial agriculture, which may well be coming into our regions, we could learn from the initiatives in the global north.
Could I say something on that as well? Yeah, just I appreciate the question, and just to emphasize that the 70% that are fed outside the industrial food system, they receive something like 25 or 30% of the resources, and all the other resources go to the 30%. And also, when the funding is going to that 30%, it tends to concentrate, and when power concentrates, it tends to expand. So that 70%, they're under threat. So these two systems, although they seem different, they're deeply interwoven with one another, and we have to remember that addressing the problems of the 30% can help create space for the 70% to grow.
And just to add a data point to that, in our analysis, 0.1% of the companies we think across the whole food system capture about half of the revenues. 0.1% capture half the revenues. So totally take the point. There are 70% of the people sort of, if you like, living outside the system we've been talking about, but we have to address this industrial system because that's what's causing the problems.
Well, on that sobering note, can I invite this lady here who had her hand up earlier to make her point?
Thank you very much. I'm Oshani Pereira from the Shumba Center for Food and Climate, one of the co-founders. I totally concur with Dr. Agrawal. Aggregation is key. What we need is also some level of harmonization in what we mean by sustainable agriculture, sustainable farming, agroecology, regen, so that the lenders can also begin to put in place the instruments needed to lend to smallholders at scale. Totally concur with you. We are leading a project with the Global Donor Platform for Rural Development to answer two questions. One, how can we make donor funding more catalytic? And two, is there a development multiplier, a development case, a development additionality in blended financing? And I would love to hear from you, your opinions on this, and to include you in this ongoing work, because if we can get the dwindling but ever catalytic part of donor money to address, Chris, that 1%, maybe we're seeing the changes we're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Did anyone have a comment to make to that? Nope. Move on to another question then. Gentleman at the back.
Thanks. I spent 20 years working undercover documenting the harms of factory farming and the animal agriculture industry. It shocked me, it saddened me, it took me right to the depths of despair. On the back of that, though, I wanted to do something positive. So I set up a small community-supported agricultural market garden in Cornwall, where I'm from. And I tried to make that work. I was veganic, followed organic principles, used no animal inputs, no manures, bone meal fish on the site, no chemicals, pesticides, no oil, hand tillage. I just shut it last week. I can't make it work. I can't compete against big agribusiness. Difficult to find land, difficult to get finance for sites under the 5 hectares. What can you say to me to give it another crack? I'd like to do it, but at the moment I just can't.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say there are, at least where I live in Canada, there are small community, basically investment funds for financing small-scale farmers for small-scale loans. I don't invest my money in big banks and shares and all that, but I invest my money in this kind of initiative because it's supporting local community farmers. And I think these kind of social finance initiatives, I know they're small, they're dispersed, they don't earn their investors very much money, but they are there and they're growing, and there might be some sort of initiatives like that you might be able to benefit from.
We're actually running over, so unless...
Very quick.
No, there's one more question I wanted to take, if that's all right. Yes?
Thank you very much to all the panelists for a wonderful presentation. I am Pankaj Casey from Humane Society International Europe. My question is, to all the panelists, how cheap or expensive should the food be? And what might be, in your opinion, the societal and political implications of your answer?
Wow, so we'll be very quick and succinct, I think. Who would like to answer that? Glenn?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say to the gentleman in the back, very compelling story, and I think really embodies the story that needs to be told about the unequal food system. I'd love to follow up with you about telling that story. In answer to the question of how cheap or dear our food needs to be, I think what strikes me is that when you look at any of these challenges, especially if you include externalities, but even if not, the difference between the cost of doing it right and doing it wrong is marginal. What we have seen when it comes to deforestation, channeling expansion onto degraded lands doesn't cost any more, often has cost savings, and is probably the single most important ecological gain. Similarly, regenerative agriculture practices, cover crops, protecting waterways, managing manure better, feed additives, and even shifting to alternative proteins. Like, it's such a small percentage of the global market right now. If we can scale it to 10%, we can give alternative proteins the ability to compete on a level playing field at scale with the meat industry. I don't actually think if there's sort of any, even like 6 months, 1 year long-term thinking, that there are any fundamental financial obstacles to transforming our food system to be something far more sustainable and healthy.
Thank you. And one more comment from Rachel.
I think it was really, and this is pointing the point to the piece that's ongoing on putting a cost on detrimental practices and pricing in the cost of nature and natural capital. And if I just use the example of animal welfare, there's actually a lot of hidden costs into high volume, cheap production of meat in terms of you get fatalities of those animals, when transport conditions are subpar, then often even if the farmers who have lovingly brought up and cared for their animals, but then when they're transported to slaughter, they're often lost because the conditions are so awful. Similarly in different parts of it where you get disease in high populations of animals being kept together. So actually, I don't think these costs are sufficiently captured, and this is an area that should be costed into it when we think about the cost of our food as well.
Thank you.
Can I say just
You have 5 seconds.
3 seconds. I think food should be as cheap as necessary for zero hunger. And this could be whether you want to do things with production, distribution, give it free for those who can't afford it. So our aim should be zero hunger and good nutrition, and then we can decide on what policies we need for that.
Excellent. That's a fantastic way to finish. I have totally failed in my primary duty, which is to keep us to time. We are 8 minutes over. I'm very sorry, but it was a great discussion. And please thank our panel, which have all presented such excellent and diverse views.